What is happening here?
There's nothing left to say right now about that.
For years, fans of Sister Wives have followed the complicated and often emotional journey of the Brown family. At the center of it all has always been Kody Brown, a man who built his life around plural marriage and the women who chose to share that life with him. Among those women, Meri Brown holds a unique place. She was the first wife, the original partner, the one who stood beside Kody before the family expanded, before the cameras arrived, and before the world began watching their every move. And for a long time, many viewers believed that Meri's loyalty to Kody would never truly break. But everything changed. In recent conversations and reflections, Meri has begun to speak more openly than ever before, not just about the struggles in her marriage, but about something far more explosive. A truth that has left fans shocked. A truth that raises serious questions about Kody's behavior over the years. And a truth that some are calling an exposure of emotional betrayal, what many viewers are now referring to as infidelity in a different form. Because in a plural marriage, the definition of infidelity isn't always what people expect. At first glance, it may seem confusing. After all, Kody was legally and spiritually married to multiple women. The entire structure of the family was built around the idea that he would have relationships with more than one wife. So how can infidelity exist in a situation where multiple relationships are accepted? That's the question fans have been asking, and the answer lies not in the number of relationships, but in how those relationships were handled. For Meri, the issue wasn't simply that Kody had other wives. It was how he treated those relationships differently. Over time, viewers began noticing a shift. Moments on the show started to reveal a growing emotional distance between Meri and Kody. Conversations became strained, interactions felt forced, and the warmth that once defined their relationship seemed to fade. At the same time, Kody's connection with Robyn Brown appeared to grow stronger. This contrast didn't go unnoticed. Fans started asking questions. Was Kody favoring one wife over the others? Was he emotionally withdrawing from Meri while investing more into another relationship? And most importantly, did that imbalance cross a line? For Meri, the answer seems to be yes. In her recent reflections, she has hinted at feeling abandoned long before the relationship officially ended. She described a situation where she was still technically part of the marriage, but no longer truly included in it. That kind of emotional separation can be just as painful as physical betrayal. And for many viewers, it began to look like something more than just a struggling relationship. It started to feel like a form of infidelity, not in the traditional sense, but in the emotional sense. Because even within a plural marriage, there are expectations. Each relationship is supposed to be nurtured, respected, and maintained. When one relationship is prioritized at the expense of another, it can create deep wounds, and those wounds don't heal easily. Meri's story is a powerful example of that. For years, she remained committed to a marriage that seemed to be slipping further away from her. She stayed through the challenges, the distance, and the uncertainty. But as time went on, it became clear that something had fundamentally changed. And that change wasn't just about fading love. It was about broken trust. One of the most difficult aspects of Meri's journey was how public it became. Unlike most people dealing with relationship struggles, her story played out on national television. Every awkward conversation, every emotional moment, and every sign of distance was captured for millions of viewers to see. That kind of exposure adds another layer of complexity to an already painful situation. It also shapes how audiences interpret what's happening. Some viewers sympathize deeply with Meri. They saw a woman trying to hold on to a relationship that no longer gave her the emotional connection she needed. Others viewed the situation differently, pointing to past controversies and questioning whether both sides shared responsibility for the breakdown. But regardless of where people stood, one thing became increasingly clear. The marriage between Meri and Kody was no longer functioning as it once had. And as more details began to emerge, the narrative started to shift. Instead of focusing only on the idea of plural marriage, fans began looking more closely at the emotional dynamics within the relationships. They started asking whether Kody's actions aligned with the principles he once claimed to follow. And that's where the idea of disgusting infidelity begins to take shape, not as a literal accusation of breaking traditional marital rules, but as a reflection of how deeply hurt and neglected Meri felt. In her own way, Meri began revealing a side of the story that hadn't been fully explored before, a side that suggested the breakdown of their marriage wasn't just inevitable, It was the result of years of emotional imbalance, years of feeling pushed aside, years of watching a relationship change into something unrecognizable, and perhaps most importantly, years of silence. Because for a long time, Meri didn't speak openly about these feelings. She stayed quiet, she remained part of the family, she continued appearing on the show. But now, that silence has started to break, and with it comes a wave of new questions. What exactly happened behind the scenes? How long had these issues been building? And why is Meri choosing to speak out now? As we move into the next part of the story, we'll take a closer look at the early years of Meri and Kody's relationship, before the other marriages, before the cameras, and before everything began to fall apart. Because to understand the present, we have to go back to where it all began. Before the cameras, before the public scrutiny, and long before the emotional distance that viewers would later witness on Sister Wives, the relationship between Meri Brown and Kody Brown began in a very different place. It was a time when everything felt simpler. Their story started as a traditional monogamous relationship. For a brief period, it was just the two of them building a life together, forming the foundation that would eventually grow into something far more complex. Meri wasn't just Kody's first wife, she was his only wife at the time, and that distinction matters, because in those early days, their relationship carried all the expectations, hopes, and emotional investment of a typical marriage. They were partners in the truest sense, learning about each other, making decisions together, and envisioning a shared future. But even then, the seeds of change were already being planted. Both Meri and Kody were raised in a culture where plural marriage was not only accepted, but encouraged. The idea of expanding the family wasn't something that came out of nowhere. It was always part of the broader belief system they were surrounded by. Still, understanding a concept and living it are two very different things. For Meri, agreeing to plural marriage wasn't necessarily easy. It required a level of emotional sacrifice that many viewers may not fully appreciate. Imagine building a life with someone, becoming their partner, and then choosing to invite others into that relationship, not because something is wrong, but because it aligns with deeply held beliefs. That decision alone changes everything. And for Meri, it marked the beginning of a long and complicated journey. When Janelle Brown entered the family as the second wife, the dynamic shifted almost immediately. No matter how much preparation or belief supports a decision like that, the reality can still be challenging. Now, Meri was no longer the only partner. She had to share time, attention, and emotional connection. And while the family often spoke about unity and cooperation, there were underlying tensions that couldn't be ignored. Over time, those tensions became more visible. Then came Christine Brown, adding another layer to an already complicated structure. With each new relationship, the emotional balance became harder to maintain. Each wife had her own needs, her own expectations, and her own way of connecting with Kody. And Kody himself was now responsible for managing multiple marriages simultaneously. It was a system that required constant effort, communication, and fairness. But even in the early years, cracks began to form. Meri's position as the first wife gave her a unique role in the family, but it also came with its own pressures. She was expected to help integrate new wives, support the growing family, and maintain harmony within the household. At the same time, she was navigating her own feelings about sharing her husband. That balance wasn't always easy to achieve. In fact, many of the emotional struggles that would later become more obvious may have started during this period. Because while plural marriage was presented as a unified lifestyle, it didn't eliminate the complexities of human emotion. Jealousy, insecurity, and the need for individual attention didn't simply disappear. They had to be managed, and sometimes they weren't managed well. For Kody, the addition of each new wife brought excitement and a sense of expansion, but it also required him to divide his time and emotional energy in ways that became increasingly difficult to sustain. Each relationship demanded attention, each wife wanted to feel valued, and over time, maintaining that balance became one of the biggest challenges in the family. When Robyn Brown later joined the family, the dynamic shifted once again, but this time in a way that would have lasting consequences. Robyn's arrival came years after the initial structure had been established. By that point, the relationships between Meri, Janelle, and Christine had already gone through their own ups and downs. They had built a system, imperfect as it may have been, that allowed them to coexist. But Robyn's entry changed that system, and for Meri, it introduced a new emotional challenge that would eventually play a major role in the breakdown of her relationship with Kody. In the early stages, Meri appeared supportive of Robyn joining the family. In fact, she was often portrayed as someone who helped facilitate that transition. But support doesn't always mean the absence of internal struggle. Behind the scenes, it's possible that Meri was already beginning to feel the weight of everything she had sacrificed. The more the family grew, the more her role seemed to shift. From being the central partner, she gradually became one part of a much larger structure. And while that was always part of the plan, living it day to day can feel very different than imagining it. Looking back, these early years are critical to understand what would happen later, because the emotional patterns that developed during this time didn't just disappear, they evolved. Small imbalances can grow into larger issues. Moments of feeling overlooked can turn into long-term emotional distance, and relationships that once felt strong can begin to weaken if they aren't consistently nurtured. For Meri and Kody, the foundation of their marriage was built during a time when everything was possible. But as the family expanded and the dynamics became more complex, that foundation was tested in ways neither of them may have fully anticipated. And as we move forward in the story, we'll begin to see how those early choices, those initial shifts in the relationship, set the stage for everything that followed. Because what started as a shared vision of family and faith would eventually become something much more complicated. And for Meri, the emotional cost of that transformation would only continue to grow.
As the Brown family continued to grow on Sister Wives, something subtle but powerful began to change in the dynamic between Meri Brown and Kody Brown. At first, it wasn't obvious. In the early seasons, the family still presented a united front. There were smiles, shared meals, group decisions, and the constant emphasis on togetherness. Even when challenges appeared, they were often framed as part of the normal ups and downs of a plural marriage. But over time, viewers began to notice something different. It wasn't just what was being said, it was what wasn't. Moments between Meri and Kody started to feel distant. Conversations lacked warmth. Interactions seemed more formal than affectionate. And perhaps most telling of all, the emotional connection that once defined their relationship appeared to be fading. Fans didn't need a dramatic confrontation to see it. The shift was happening in quiet ways. A lack of eye contact, short, surface-level conversations, an absence of the easy chemistry that had once been there. These small details began to add up. At the same time, another dynamic was becoming more visible: Kody's growing closeness with Robyn Brown. From the moment Robyn entered the family, there was a noticeable spark between her and Kody. Their connection felt different, more intense, more emotionally engaged. And as the seasons progressed, that connection seemed to deepen. While Kody's relationships with the other wives, including Janelle Brown and Christine Brown, continued in their own ways, it was the contrast between Robyn and Meri that stood out the most. Because as one relationship appeared to grow stronger, the other seemed to weaken. For viewers, this raised important questions. Was Kody intentionally prioritizing one relationship over the others? Or was this simply the natural evolution of a complicated family structure? For Meri, the experience seemed far more personal. Over time, her role in Kody's life appeared to diminish. She went from being his first partner, the person who had been there from the beginning, to someone who often seemed on the outside looking in. And that kind of shift doesn't happen overnight. It builds gradually, through missed moments, through unspoken frustrations, through the slow erosion of emotional connection. One of the most difficult aspects of this shift was how visible it became. Because unlike private relationships, this one was being documented for millions of viewers. Every uncomfortable interaction, every awkward silence, every moment of distance, it was all there on screen. And as the audience watched, interpretations began to form. Some fans believed that Meri was being unfairly pushed aside. They saw a woman who had committed years of her life to a relationship only to find herself emotionally abandoned. Others took a more complicated view, suggesting that both Meri and Kody played roles in the breakdown of their connection. But regardless of perspective, the shift itself was undeniable. Even within the context of plural marriage, there are expectations. Each wife is supposed to have a meaningful relationship with the husband. Each relationship is supposed to be nurtured and maintained. When that balance begins to break, the entire structure can feel unstable. And that's exactly what seemed to be happening. For Meri, the emotional distance wasn't just about feeling less important. It was about feeling disconnected, about being part of a marriage that no longer functioned as a true partnership. And that kind of experience can be deeply painful, because it's not a clean break. It's not a clear ending. It's something far more complicated, a relationship that still exists in name, but not in reality. As the seasons progressed, this dynamic became harder to ignore. There were moments when Meri tried to express her feelings, moments when she hinted at the loneliness she was experiencing. But those moments often didn't lead to resolution. Instead, they highlighted just how far apart she and Kody had become. At the same time, Kody's perspective seemed to shift as well. He began speaking more openly about his frustrations, about the challenges of maintaining multiple relationships, about the emotional strain of the family dynamic. But what stood out to many viewers was how differently he seemed to engage with each wife. With Robyn, there was often patience and understanding. With Meri, the tone sometimes felt more distant, or even dismissive. And that difference didn't go unnoticed. Because in any relationship, plural or otherwise, how people treat each other matters. Consistency matters. Effort matters. And when those elements begin to disappear, it can change everything. For many fans, this is where the idea of emotional infidelity begins to take shape. Not as a traditional betrayal, but as a shift in emotional investment. A situation where one relationship is given more attention, more care, and more connection than another.
And over time, that imbalance can feel just as damaging. Meri's experience seems to reflect that. She remained part of the family. She continued to show up, but the relationship itself no longer appeared to meet her emotional needs. And as this reality became clear, the foundation of her marriage to Kody began to weaken even further. Looking back, this period represents a turning point. It's where the cracks in the relationship became visible, not just to those involved, but to the audience as well. It's where the narrative began to shift from a story about plural marriage to a story about emotional disconnection. And it's where the questions that fans are still asking today really started to take shape. Because once people noticed the shift, they couldn't unsee it. And as we move into the next part of the story, we'll explore one of the most controversial chapters in Meri's journey, a moment that would bring even more attention to the struggles in her relationship and change how many viewers saw her role in the family, a moment that would test everything. By the time viewers reached this chapter of Sister Wives, the cracks in the relationship between Meri Brown and Kody Brown were already visible. But what happened next didn't just expose those cracks, it shattered the illusion that things could quietly be repaired behind the scenes. This was the moment that brought everything into the spotlight, the moment that turned private pain into public controversy, the moment fans still talk about today. It began with something that at first seemed small. Meri, who had been increasingly isolated within the family, found herself searching for connection. The emotional distance between her and Kody had grown so wide that it left a void, one that she struggled to fill. And in that vulnerable space, she reached out. What followed was an online relationship that quickly became one of the most talked about storylines in the show's history. At the time, it appeared that Meri had formed a bond with someone outside the family, someone who seemed to understand her, someone who gave her the attention and validation she had been missing. For Meri, this connection may have felt like a lifeline. After years of feeling emotionally disconnected, she finally had someone who was listening, someone who made her feel seen again. But the situation took a dramatic turn, because the person Meri believed she was talking to wasn't who they claimed to be. It was later revealed that the entire relationship was a deception, a catfishing scandal that shocked both the family and the audience. Suddenly, what had seemed like a private emotional struggle became a very public controversy, and the fallout was immediate. For many fans, this moment changed how they saw Meri. Some felt sympathy for her, recognizing the loneliness that had led her into the situation. They saw a woman who had been emotionally neglected, searching for connection in a way that ultimately backfired. Others were more critical. They viewed her actions as a betrayal of the family, regardless of the circumstances. In their eyes, even an emotional connection outside the marriage crossed a line. But what made the situation particularly complicated was the context. Because by this point, Meri's relationship with Kody was already deeply strained. The emotional distance that had been building for years didn't suddenly appear. It had been there long before the scandal. And that raises an important question. Was this truly the beginning of the end? Or was it simply the moment when everything that had been happening beneath the surface finally came into the open? For Kody, the situation seemed to reinforce his growing frustration with the relationship. In the aftermath, his tone toward Meri shifted even further. Where there had once been distance, there now appeared to be a deeper sense of distrust. And that distrust didn't fade quickly. If anything, it became a defining feature of their interactions moving forward. For Meri, the experience was devastating. Not only had she been deceived by someone she trusted, but she also had to deal with the public exposure of that deception. Her vulnerability was no longer private. It was part of a storyline watched by millions. And that kind of exposure can be incredibly difficult to navigate. But perhaps the most significant impact of the scandal was how it changed the dynamics within the entire family. Because in a plural marriage, the actions of one person don't just affect one relationship, they ripple outward. Trust, already fragile, became even more complicated. Communication, already strained, became more challenging. And the idea of unity that the family had worked so hard to present began to feel more distant than ever. At the same time, this moment also forced viewers to reconsider the narrative. Up until this point, much of the focus had been on Kody's relationships with his wives. But now the spotlight shifted. Now people were asking questions about Meri, about her choices, about her motivations, and about what this situation revealed about the state of her marriage. For some, it confirmed that the relationship was already broken, that Meri's actions were not the cause of the breakdown, but a symptom of it. For others, it complicated the narrative. It introduced a layer of accountability that couldn't be ignored. But regardless of perspective, the shift itself was undeniable. Even within the context of plural marriage, there are expectations. Each wife is supposed to have a meaningful relationship with the husband. Each relationship is supposed to be nurtured and maintained. When that balance begins to break, the entire structure can feel unstable. And that's exactly what seemed to be happening. For Meri, the emotional distance wasn't just about feeling less important. It was about feeling disconnected, about being part of a marriage that no longer functioned as a true partnership. And that kind of experience can be deeply painful, because it's not a clean break. It's not a clear ending. It's something far more complicated, a relationship that still exists in name, but not in reality. As the seasons progressed, this dynamic became harder to ignore. There were moments when Meri tried to express her feelings, moments when she hinted at the loneliness she was experiencing. But those moments often didn't lead to resolution. Instead, they highlighted just how far apart she and Kody had become. At the same time, Kody's perspective seemed to shift as well. He began speaking more openly about his frustrations, about the challenges of maintaining multiple relationships, about the emotional strain of the family dynamic. But what stood out to many viewers was how differently he seemed to engage with each wife. With Robyn, there was often patience and understanding. With Meri, the tone sometimes felt more distant, or even dismissive. And that difference didn't go unnoticed. Because in any relationship, plural or otherwise, how people treat each other matters. Consistency matters. Effort matters. And when those elements begin to disappear, it can change everything. For many fans, this is where the idea of emotional infidelity begins to take shape. Not as a traditional betrayal, but as a shift in emotional investment. A situation where one relationship is given more attention, more care, and more connection than another. And over time, that imbalance can feel just as damaging. Meri's experience seems to reflect that. She remained part of the family. She continued to show up, but the relationship itself no longer appeared to meet her emotional needs. And as this reality became clear, the foundation of her marriage to Kody began to weaken even further. Looking back, this period represents a turning point. It's where the cracks in the relationship became visible, not just to those involved, but to the audience as well. It's where the narrative began to shift from a story about plural marriage to a story about emotional disconnection. And it's where the questions that fans are still asking today really started to take shape. Because once people noticed the shift, they couldn't unsee it. And
By this stage in the journey of sister wives, something had clearly shifted inside Meri Brown. For years, she had held on to hope, held on to the idea that her relationship with Kody Brown could somehow return to what it once was, held on to the belief that if she stayed patient, stayed loyal, and stayed committed, things might eventually change. But now, that hope was starting to fade. Not all at once, not in a dramatic moment, but slowly, quietly, and almost imperceptibly at first. Because letting go isn't always loud. Sometimes it happens in silence, in the realization that you're the only one still trying, in the recognition that the effort is no longer being matched, in the understanding that what you're holding on to may no longer exist. For Meri, that realization came after years of emotional distance, difficult conversations, and the lingering effects of the scandal that had already changed everything. She had tried to rebuild trust. She had tried to reconnect. She had tried to find a way forward. But with each attempt, it became more clear that the relationship she was fighting for was no longer being fought for on the other side. And that's where the real shift happened. Because up until this point, Meri's story had been about endurance, about staying, about holding on even when things were falling apart. But now it was starting to become about something else, about self-awareness, about recognizing her own needs, about asking a difficult but necessary question. What am I actually holding on to? At the same time, Kody's perspective seemed to move further away from reconciliation. His language, his tone, and his actions all suggested that he had emotionally stepped back from the relationship. Where there had once been distance, there now appeared to be detachment, and that distinction matters. Distance can sometimes be closed. Detachment is much harder to overcome, because it often means the emotional connection has already been lost. For viewers, this stage of the story was both painful and revealing. Painful because it showed just how far things had fallen. Revealing because it made something clear that had been building for a long time. This wasn't just a rough patch. This was the end of something, even if it hadn't been officially acknowledged yet. One of the most telling aspects of this phase was how Meri began to speak about her situation. Her words carried a different tone, less hopeful, more reflective, more grounded in reality. She wasn't just reacting to what was happening anymore. She was beginning to process it, to understand it, to accept it. And acceptance can be one of the hardest parts of any emotional journey because it requires letting go of what you wanted things to be. It requires facing what they actually are. And for Meri, that meant acknowledging that her marriage was no longer a partnership in the way she had once believed. At the same time, her role within the larger family was also changing. She was still part of the structure, still connected to the history, still present in many ways, but emotionally things felt different, more separate, more independent. And that shift didn't go unnoticed by viewers. Many began to see Meri in a new light, not just as someone struggling within a relationship, but as someone beginning to rediscover herself outside of it. Because for years, her identity had been closely tied to the family and to her role within it. Now she was starting to explore what it meant to exist beyond that role, to define herself on her own terms. And that process, while empowering, is also deeply challenging. It involves uncertainty. It involves risk.
It involves stepping into the unknown, but it also opens the door to something new, something that may not have been possible before. For Kody, this shift seemed to solidify the direction he was already moving in. His focus appeared increasingly centered on the relationships that felt stable to him, particularly his connection with Robyn Brown, and that focus only reinforced the reality that his relationship with Meri was no longer a priority, which brings us back to the idea that has been building throughout this story, the idea of emotional infidelity. Because even within a plural marriage, the expectation is that each relationship is valued, that each partner receives attention, effort, and care. When one relationship is effectively abandoned while another is nurtured, it creates an imbalance that can feel deeply unfair. And for Meri, that imbalance had become impossible to ignore. Looking back, this moment represents a turning point, not because of a single dramatic event, but because of an internal shift, a change in perspective, a decision, even if not fully spoken yet, that things could not continue the way they had been. Because sometimes the most significant changes don't happen in what we do, they happen in what we finally understand. And for Meri, that understanding was beginning to take shape. As we move into the next part of the story, we'll explore what happens when that internal shift becomes external action, when realization turns into decision, and when the possibility of walking away becomes something more than just a thought. Because once you stop holding on, the next step is deciding where to go. After the catfishing scandal, nothing in the Brown family ever felt the same again on Sister Wives. What had once been presented as a strong, if complicated, family structure now felt fragile, uncertain, and deeply divided. And at the center of that tension were Meri Brown and Kody Brown. The damage had already been done, but what came next would determine whether there was any chance of repair or if the relationship was beyond saving. In the immediate aftermath, there were attempts to address what had happened. Conversations took place, feelings were expressed. At least on the surface, it seemed like both Meri and Kody were trying to navigate the situation. But something felt different, because instead of moving towards understanding, their interactions often revealed just how far apart they had become. Kody's response to the situation was especially telling. Rather than focusing solely on the deception Meri had experienced, he seemed to place significant emphasis on her role in the situation. From his perspective, trust had been broken, and that breach of trust became a central issue moving forward. But for many viewers, this reaction raised important questions, because while Meri had clearly made choices that contributed to the situation, the emotional context couldn't be ignored. She hadn't entered that online relationship in a vacuum. It came after years of feeling disconnected, overlooked, and emotionally isolated within her marriage, and that context complicated everything. For Meri, the aftermath wasn't just about dealing with the fallout of the scandal. It was about confronting a reality she had been avoiding for a long time, the reality that her relationship with Kody might already be over in everything but name. And that realization didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly, through difficult conversations, through moments of reflection, through the growing awareness that the connection she had once fought so hard to maintain was no longer there. At the same time, the dynamics within the larger family continued to shift. Relationships between the wives had always been complex, but now there was an added layer of tension. Trust once shaken doesn't easily return, and in a family built on shared relationships, that kind of instability can affect everyone. Meanwhile, Kody's connection with Robyn Brown continued to appear strong. In fact, for many viewers, it seemed stronger than ever. And that contrast only made Meri's situation feel more difficult, because while one relationship appeared to be thriving, hers seemed to be fading away. This imbalance didn't just affect Meri emotionally, it also shaped how the audience interpreted the situation. Some saw Kody's reaction as justified, given the circumstances. Others felt that he was ignoring the deeper issues that had led to the scandal in the first place. They questioned whether he was taking responsibility for his role in the breakdown of the relationship, because relationships are rarely one-sided. They are built and broken by the actions of both people involved. And in this case, it was becoming increasingly clear that the problems between Meri and Kody had been building for years. The scandal didn't create those problems, it exposed them. As time went on, the possibility of reconciliation seemed to grow more distant. There were moments when it appeared that the two of them might try to rebuild something, moments when conversations hinted at the idea of working things out, but those moments were often followed by setbacks, misunderstandings, frustration, and a lingering sense that neither of them truly knew how to move forward. For Meri, this period was one of the most emotionally challenging chapters of her life. She was caught between holding on and letting go, between the past she had invested so much in and the uncertain future ahead. And making that kind of decision is never easy, especially when it involves not just a relationship but an entire way of life. Because leaving the marriage didn't just mean leaving Kody, it meant redefining her place within the family. It meant stepping away from a structure that had shaped her identity for years, and it meant facing the possibility of starting over. For Kody, the situation seemed to solidify the direction he was already moving in. His focus appeared increasingly centered on the relationships that felt stable to him, particularly his connection with Robyn Brown, and that focus only reinforced the reality that his relationship with Meri was no longer a priority. Which brings us back to the idea that has been building throughout this story, the idea of emotional infidelity. Because even within a plural marriage, the expectation is that each relationship is valued, that each partner receives attention, effort, and care. When one relationship is effectively abandoned while another is nurtured, it creates an imbalance that can feel deeply unfair. And for Meri, that imbalance had become impossible to ignore.
Looking back, this moment represents a turning point, not because of a single dramatic event, but because of an internal shift, a change in perspective, a decision, even if not fully spoken yet, that things could not continue the way they had been. Because sometimes the most significant changes don't happen in what we do, they happen in what we finally understand. And for Meri, that understanding was beginning to take shape. As we move into the next part of the story, we'll explore what happens when that internal shift becomes external action, when realization turns into decision, and when the possibility of walking away becomes something more than just a thought. Because once you stop holding on, the next step is deciding where to go. After the catfishing scandal, nothing in the Brown family ever felt the same again on Sister Wives. What had once been presented as a strong, if complicated family structure, now felt fragile, uncertain, and deeply divided. And at the center of that tension were Meri Brown and Kody Brown. The damage had already been done, but what came next would determine whether there was any chance of repair or if the relationship was beyond saving. In the immediate aftermath, there were attempts to address what had happened. Conversations took place, feelings were expressed. At least on the surface, it seemed like both Meri and Kody were trying to navigate the situation. But something felt different, because instead of moving towards understanding, their interactions often revealed just how far apart they had become. Kody's response to the situation was especially telling. Rather than focusing solely on the deception Meri had experienced, he seemed to place significant emphasis on her role in the situation. From his perspective, trust had been broken, and that breach of trust became a central issue moving forward. But for many viewers, this reaction raised important questions, because while Meri had clearly made choices that contributed to the situation, the emotional context couldn't be ignored. She hadn't entered that online relationship in a vacuum. It came after years of feeling disconnected, overlooked, and emotionally isolated within her marriage, and that context complicated everything. For Meri, the aftermath wasn't just about dealing with the fallout of the scandal. It was about confronting a reality she had been avoiding for a long time, the reality that her relationship with Kody might already be over in everything but name. And that realization didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly, through difficult conversations, through moments of reflection, through the growing awareness that the connection she had once fought so hard to maintain was no longer there. At the same time, the dynamics within the larger family continued to shift. Relationships between the wives had always been complex, but now there was an added layer of tension. Trust once shaken doesn't easily return.
By this point in Sister Wives, the emotional distance between Meri Brown and Kody Brown was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. What had once been a gradual shift, small moments of disconnect, quiet tension, and unspoken frustration, had now turned into something much more final. This wasn't just distance anymore. This was separation in everything but name. And perhaps the most striking part of this phase was how openly that reality began to surface. There were conversations, real, direct, and often uncomfortable, where the truth could no longer be avoided. Kody began to express something that many viewers had suspected for a long time. He no longer saw his relationship with Meri as a functioning marriage. Those words, whether spoken directly or implied through his actions, carried enormous weight. Because once that line is crossed, once one person emotionally steps out of the relationship, it becomes incredibly difficult to find a way back. For Meri, hearing and experiencing that shift was devastating. Even after everything, the years of distance, the scandal, the attempts to reconnect, there had still been a part of her holding on. A part that believed there might be a way to rebuild something. But now, that possibility seemed to disappear. Not gradually, not uncertainly, but clearly. And clarity, while important, can also be painful, because it forces you to face the truth without any illusions left to protect you. At the same time, the dynamic within the larger family continued to evolve. The structure that had once held everyone together was beginning to unravel. Relationships between the wives were changing. The sense of unity that had defined the earlier seasons was becoming harder to maintain. And in many ways, the separation between Meri and Kody reflected a broader shift happening across the entire family. Because this wasn't just one relationship breaking down. It was part of a larger pattern. A pattern that viewers were starting to recognize more clearly. Kody's focus had become increasingly centered on one relationship in particular, his connection with Robyn Brown. While other relationships struggled, that one appeared to remain strong. And that contrast continued to fuel conversations among fans. Was this simply the natural outcome of evolving relationships? Or was it evidence of a deeper imbalance within the family? For Meri, the answer likely felt very personal. Because regardless of the reasons behind it,
the result was the same. She was no longer in a marriage that provided emotional connection, partnership, or support. And at a certain point, that reality becomes impossible to ignore. One of the most powerful aspects of this stage was how Meri began to carry herself. There was a noticeable change. Less uncertainty, less hesitation, more awareness, more strength. It didn't mean the situation was easy. It didn't mean the pain had disappeared, but it did mean that she was beginning to see things clearly. And clarity often leads to decisions, even if those decisions take time. For Kody, this phase seemed to solidify his stance. He was no longer trying to repair the relationship. He was no longer presenting the idea that things could return to the way they once were. Instead, his words and actions suggested acceptance of a different reality, one where his relationship with Meri had effectively ended, even if the official structure of the family had not yet fully caught up to that reality. And that's what made this stage so significant, because sometimes relationships end long before they are formally acknowledged. They end in the absence of effort, in the absence of connection, in the absence of mutual commitment. And by this point, all of those elements seem to be missing. For viewers, watching this unfold was both compelling and emotional, because it wasn't just about drama, it was about real human experiences, about what happens when a relationship reaches a point where it can no longer continue in a meaningful way, about what it means to let go of something that has been a major part of your life, and about how people move forward after that kind of loss. Meri's journey during this time began to shift from holding on to preparing for what comes next, even if that preparation wasn't fully visible yet, even if it hadn't been officially declared. The direction was becoming clear. And once that direction becomes clear, the next step is often inevitable. Looking back, this stage represents the moment when the relationship stopped being uncertain, stopped being something that might still be saved, and became something that had already ended, at least emotionally. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because once distance becomes permanent, the only question left is what happens next. Does it remain unspoken? Or does it finally become official? In the next part, we'll explore the moment when that question is answered. The moment when what has been building for so long is finally acknowledged. And the impact that decision has, not just on Meri and Kody, but on the entire Brown family. By the time this stage unfolded on Sister Wives, the reality that had been building for years was finally impossible to ignore. The relationship between Meri Brown and Kody Brown wasn't just struggling anymore. It was over. Not quietly, not privately, but in a way that the audience and the family could clearly see. For a long time, there had been a kind of unspoken understanding, a sense that things weren't working, but no one was fully saying it out loud. That silence created space for hope, for interpretation, for the idea that maybe, somehow, things could still change. But now, that silence was breaking. And when it did, it brought a level of clarity that changed everything. Conversations became more direct, statements became more honest, and the emotional reality of the situation was finally being acknowledged. Kody made it clear, through both his words and his actions, that he no longer considered his relationship with Meri to be a true marriage. That kind of statement carries weight, because it removes any remaining ambiguity. It turns a complicated situation into a clear one. And for Meri, hearing that truth, whether directly or indirectly, was a defining moment. Because once something is said out loud, it becomes real in a different way. It's no longer something you can avoid or reinterpret. It's something you have to face. And facing that reality meant accepting that the relationship she had spent years trying to hold on to was no longer there. But what made this moment even more powerful was how Meri responded to it. In the past, she had often been in a position of waiting. Waiting for change, waiting for effort, waiting for signs that things might improve. But now her perspective was shifting. She was no longer just reacting to Kody's decisions. She was beginning to make her own. And that shift, from waiting to deciding, is one of the most important transitions in any personal journey. Because it marks the moment when someone takes control of their own path. For viewers, this was a significant change. They were no longer just watching a relationship fall apart. They were watching someone begin to move forward. And that forward movement didn't happen all at once. It came in steps, in conversations, in moments of reflection, in the gradual realization that staying in the same place was no longer an option. At the same time, the larger family dynamic continued to evolve. The structure that had once defined the Brown family was changing in ways that could no longer be denied. Other relationships were also being questioned. Other separations were taking place. And the idea of one unified plural marriage was becoming less and less of a reality. In many ways, Meri and Kody's situation was part of a larger transformation, a transformation that affected everyone involved.
But what made this particular moment stand out was its emotional clarity. There was no longer confusion about where things stood, no longer uncertainty about the direction. The only question left was what would happen next. For Kody, the answer seemed to be acceptance. Acceptance of a new reality where certain relationships were no longer part of his life in the same way, and a continued focus on the relationships that remained strong, particularly his connection with Robyn Brown. For Meri, the answer was more complex, because moving forward meant more than just acknowledging the end of a relationship. It meant redefining her identity, reimagining her future, and stepping into a life that looked very different from the one she had known for so long. That kind of transition is never easy. It involves uncertainty, it involves letting go of the familiar, it involves facing the unknown. But it also creates opportunity. The opportunity to build something new, to discover new strengths, to create a life that reflects who you are now, not who you were in the past. And for Meri, that opportunity was beginning to take shape. Looking back, this stage represents the moment when everything becomes clear, when the truth is no longer hidden behind silence or uncertainty, when the emotional reality of a situation is finally acknowledged by everyone involved. And while that clarity can be painful, it is also necessary, because without it, there can be no real movement forward. As we move into the next part of the story, we'll explore what happens after that clarity, what it looks like when the end of a relationship is not just understood, but officially recognized, and how that decision impacts not just Meri and Kody, but the entire future of the Brown family. Because once the truth is out, the next step is deciding what to do with it.
By this stage in Sister Wives, what had been building for years was finally reaching its conclusion. The emotional distance, the failed attempts at reconciliation, the quiet understanding that things were no longer working, all of it led to one unavoidable moment. The point where the end of the relationship between Meri Brown and Kody Brown would no longer remain unspoken. It would become official. For a long time, their situation existed in a kind of in-between space. They were still part of the same family, still connected through history, still appearing within the same structure. But emotionally, the relationship had already ended, and that kind of limbo can be one of the hardest places to exist, because it leaves everything unresolved. There's no clear closure, no defined next step, just a lingering sense of something that used to be, but no longer is. Eventually, that space becomes unsustainable, and that's exactly what happened here. The conversations that followed were some of the most important and most difficult of the entire journey, because they required both Meri and Kody to confront the truth directly, not as something implied, not as something avoided, but as something real. Kody's position had already been made clear over time. He no longer saw the relationship as a functioning marriage. He no longer expressed a desire to rebuild it, and he no longer acted in a way that suggested there was a path back. For Meri, acknowledging that reality meant making a decision, not just emotionally, but practically. Because accepting that a relationship is over is one thing, choosing what to do next is another, and that choice carries weight. It affects not just the present, but the future as well. What made this moment especially powerful was the sense of finality that came with it. This wasn't another attempt to fix things. This wasn't another conversation about trying again. This was closure. And closure, while often necessary, can also be incredibly emotional, because it marks the end of something that once mattered deeply. For Meri, this meant letting go of a relationship that had been part of her life for decades, a relationship that had shaped her identity, a relationship that had been central to her story. And letting go of something like that is never easy. It requires strength, it requires honesty, and it requires the willingness to step into a new chapter without fully knowing what that chapter will look like. For viewers, this moment was both expected and surprising. Expected because the signs had been there for a long time. Surprising because actually seeing it happen made it real in a way that speculation never could. It turned years of tension into a clear outcome, and in doing so, it also changed the narrative of the entire show. Because this wasn't just the end of one relationship, it was part of a larger transformation within the Brown family. The idea of one unified plural marriage, something that had defined the show from the beginning, was no longer intact. Instead, the family was evolving into something very different, and that evolution raised new questions. What does the future look like for the family now? How do relationships continue or not continue after such significant changes? And what does this mean for the individuals involved? For Kody, the answer seemed to be a continued focus on the relationships that remained, particularly his connection with Robyn Brown.
For Meri, the answer was more open-ended, because while one chapter had ended, another was just beginning, and that new chapter was entirely her own. Looking back, this moment represents more than just the end of a marriage. It represents the end of an era that began with a single relationship and grew into something much larger, an era that was defined by shared beliefs, shared experiences, and shared challenges, and an era that ultimately could not sustain itself in the way it once had. But endings, as difficult as they are, also create space for beginnings. And as we move into the final part of this story, we'll explore what those beginnings might look like, what life after this relationship means for Meri, how she begins to rebuild, redefine, and move forward, and what this entire journey reveals about love, identity, and the courage it takes to walk away when something is no longer right. Because sometimes, the most important part of any story isn't how it ends, it's what happens next. The conclusion of the relationship between Meri Brown and Kody Brown marked more than just the end of a marriage. It marked the beginning of a new chapter in Meri's life. After years of emotional distance, public scrutiny, and personal challenges, Meri faced the reality of moving forward independently. This final part of her journey on Sister Wives highlights resilience, self-discovery, and the steps she took to redefine her identity outside of her role as Kody's wife. The first step was emotional healing. Meri had to confront years of hurt, disappointment, and the lingering effects of betrayal, not only the catfishing scandal, but also the emotional neglect she had experienced over the years. Therapy, reflection, and honest conversations with friends and family became essential in helping her process the end of this chapter. She recognized that the relationship had fundamentally shifted years before it officially ended, and coming to terms with that reality was crucial for her mental and emotional well-being. Simultaneously, Meri began focusing on her personal growth. This included reconnecting with passions and pursuits that had been secondary while maintaining her place in the Brown family. She explored new hobbies, invested in friendships, and dedicated time to understanding who she was beyond the role of wife in a plural marriage. For Meri, this period was as much about reclaiming her individuality as it was about coping with loss. Family dynamics also evolved. With Kody emotionally detached from their marriage and more involved with Robyn Brown, Meri's interactions with the other wives changed as well. There was a mixture of support, tension, and adjustment as everyone adapted to the new reality. While some relationships remained strong, others were inevitably impacted by the shift in the household structure. Public perception played a significant role in Meri's journey, as the cameras captured not only the struggles but also the growth. Fans who had followed her story witnessed her transformation from a woman who endured emotional neglect to someone who began asserting her boundaries and prioritizing her well-being. The narrative shifted from focusing solely on marital conflict to highlighting Meri's strength and resilience. A major part of moving forward was establishing independence. Meri worked on creating a life that was not defined by Kody or the family's hierarchy. This included managing her own finances, making decisions about her living situation, and defining her personal and professional priorities. Independence became both a practical and symbolic milestone, representing her ability to navigate life on her own terms. Romantic relationships were also reconsidered carefully. While the future of her love life remained uncertain, Meri's experience with emotional neglect and public scrutiny meant that any new connections would require trust, respect, and equality, elements that had been missing in her previous marriage. For now, the focus was on self-empowerment rather than seeking validation through others. Ultimately, this final chapter is about growth. It's about moving beyond past pain, understanding personal worth, and stepping into a life that is authentic and self-directed. Meri's story demonstrates that even after long-term emotional hardship, it is possible to find clarity, strength, and a renewed sense of purpose. For viewers, the takeaway is both poignant and inspiring. Sometimes walking away from what no longer serves you is the most courageous act of all. Meri Brown's journey on Sister Wives illustrates that endings, no matter how painful, can be the foundation for a new beginning, one built on self-respect, resilience, and the freedom to chart your own path. And while her story with Kody has ended, the story of Meri's life is far from over. Each step forward is a testament to her strength, her ability to adapt, and her commitment to living authentically. This is not just the end of a chapter, it is the opening of an entirely new book full of possibilities yet to be written. Meri's journey reminds us all, even in the most complicated and public situations, reclaiming your voice, your identity, and your independence is always worth the effort. If you want, I can now create the high CTR SEO package, tags and commas, description, and 5 thumbnail text strips specifically for this video so you can upload it immediately. Do you want me to do that next?